Hi, this is Elwin Robinson, founder of Genetic Insights, and in this video I'm going to walk through the Genetic Insights collection reports with you and help you navigate which reports can help you work out whether you have a tendency to be overweight, whether you have a tendency to gain weight, whether you have a tendency to struggle to lose weight, or if there's other root cause factors going on like nutritional, hormonal, stress-related, blood sugar-related, or others which are stopping you from being the weight that you really want to be. So how can going through your Genetic Insights reports potentially help you to lose weight? And how would we start? So obviously what we're giving you here is risk factors for things that may be stopping you from being able to lose weight. And so the default setting is to see everything in terms of the risk score. So I've got two different examples here. There's one for me, Elwin, and then I've got another one here for, let's call her Jean, someone who's given permission for me to use their genetic info anonymously as another case study, another example. And so I'll go through this with you. I'll use both examples to say how we might work out what's going on in each case. So when it comes to weight loss, one of the first things that people often want to know about, and I think rightly so because it's very important, is about the issue of what to eat. And when it comes to weight loss, there is a lot to it, obviously, but simply looking at our response to different macronutrients, specifically carbohydrate, fat, protein, as well as saturated fat, is a really good starting place. And so you can see in this case with this person, we'll call them Jean. Jean has a tendency for a worse response to carbohydrates. So what does that mean? Let's have a little look in the report. So obviously if you haven't read these first few pages before, if you need a refresher, please do. It explains the basics, and this explains how the genetics work and stuff, but let's skip ahead to the actual results. So for Jean, she has a type of, she is a genetic type that has a worse response to carbohydrates. We tend to call this the hunter-gatherer gene. So basically, as it explains here, at some point about 12,000 years ago in our human evolution, we started farming en masse, like a lot of us did, our ancestors, and therefore our diet shifted to much more carbohydrates because we were growing food rather than hunting food. And so some people's genes have adapted to that much higher carbohydrate diet and some people's haven't. This is not about good or bad in this case. This is just about different types. So as it says here, people with a certain gene variant will get more of an insulin release initially with certain grains and some less. So with this person, they're more likely to have a worse response to carbohydrates. That's something that's important to know. So this is something where there's a lot of people out there who are saying that a ketogenic diet is good, that as little carbs as possible is good because it lowers insulin. It helps to balance the blood sugar. Those type of people often recommend intermittent fasting as well. And there are other people out there, kind of more in the mainstream, who said, no, you should have a balance of macronutrients, you should have some carbs. And there are even some people on the opposite side of the scale who said you should have mainly carbs if you want to balance your blood sugar and therefore lose weight. And the truth is, they're all right depending on your genes. That's what we learned at Genetic Insights. But for this particular person, I'm not saying you should be in a ketogenic diet if you have this kind of response, but this means that, at least, especially with it saying 8%, that means that you're near the top percentile for having a worse response. And so it's just important to be aware of that. And so people who are on the opposite side, on the better response, they will often do well even with simple sugars, like sugar, honey, fruit, starch, whatever it may be, like high glycemic foods. People with typical response, they will do well with like complex carbs that are more low glycemic. They'll be okay with that, but they might struggle with high glycemic carbs. And then people with worse response, they often do better with less carbs. So you don't have to go in a ketogenic diet just because you have this, but it means it's much more likely that a ketogenic will actually help you lose weight if these are your genetics. So other than carbohydrates, obviously we also have dietary fat. And so for this person, you can see they've got a typical response. Let's just check me. I think I got the same. Yeah, typical response to fat. And so if that's you, oh no, I've actually got a good response to fat. Okay. And that is true in my experience, that no matter how much fat I eat, it definitely doesn't help me gain any weight. But for some people, that is absolutely not the case. And so if you're that person with a worse response to dietary fat, like this person has a worse response to carbohydrates, that may well swing you to avoid it. You may say, well, Elwin, what if I have a bad response to dietary fat and carbohydrates? In this case, I would say you probably want to emphasize a high protein diet, and you probably want to consider as well a source of dietary fats that are not traditional fats, by which I mean specifically MCT oil. It's actually a different kind of fat that is not metabolized in the same way by your body. And so my understanding is even with people who have a worse response to fat, they will not have such an issue of MCT oil, at least once they're used to it. And for that reason, they may do better with coconut oil as well, because a lot of that is MCT. So higher protein and consider MCTs may be a way to go if you're unlucky enough to have a bad response with both of those. Then we do have a protein report as well, because even with that, that's something that some people do have an issue with, do struggle to digest as well as they could do. And so in this case, you can see this person, yeah, they've got a better response report to dietary protein. So in that case, that's good. Protein is the most satiating of the 3 macronutrients. And so if you can handle protein, which this person's genetics seem to indicate that they have more of a tendency to be able to, then it's probably going to be safer to at least try a moderately higher protein diet, as some people, especially in the fitness world, recommend. And because protein is so satisfying, that is potentially a great weight loss strategy. Still make sure you get some carbohydrates and some fats as well to balance it out. You don't want to go pure protein. You don't want to go pure of any of the 3 nutrients. We always want some protein. Even if you have a worse response to protein, you still want to have some, but you might have, less, about half a gram per pound or slightly less even. Whereas if you have a better response to protein and you really want to lose weight and you're quite active, you might want to go closer to 1 gram per pound of body weight. So it's a big difference, but you always want to emphasize some protein if you want to lose weight, and in general. So then we also have the saturated fat report. And again, this is a question because some people obviously talk about how saturated fats are better. That's becoming more popular again. That kind of went out of style in the 80s, like butter and eggs and stuff like that were blamed for weight gain. And seed oils were pushed more in terms of, margarine and stuff like that. That's still mainstream, that those kind of seed oils are better for you, but a lot of people in the alternative health world these days will tell you that saturated fat is better for you. But actually, we found again that this does vary a bit depending on the person's genetics. So no matter what your belief on that is, whether you believe saturated fats are bad or good, you should still check out this report to see if you potentially are going to do better with more or less of them. And then, of course, if you do have a worse response to saturated fat, then you can consider that if you keep having a lot of it, then that's not going to help your weight loss journey. Now, I kind of started with the nutrients because it's often the number one thing people want to know is what do I eat? But of course, there are some reports that are, completely focused on what we're talking about. So one of them is the overweight report, right? Which I'll just open to show you. So in this case, with this report, we can see that, up to 70% of a person's difference in weight may be due to genetics. That's obviously an estimate. Now, of course, and I'll make this point for every single report, of course, we can't predict if you will be overweight because, for one thing, you will have this same result at the age of 2 or 90, right? This is, whereas, in some points in your life, you may be overweight, some points you may not. Do you see what I mean? This is indicating the tendency for you to be overweight or in fact even underweight if you are in the less likely to be overweight category. And so this is not a guarantee in either direction. And of course, this is not a diagnostic tool. We're not going to tell you, you're going to be overweight. And of course, we tend to give recommendations. And the only reason that we can give recommendations, like limiting calorie intake, for this person, exercise, some of the more obvious things I guess you heard from everyone will be at the top slots, but you know, if you scroll down later, you might see things like therapy. We're going to talk about emotional issues and stuff in a minute. And, you know, there absolutely is evidence for that. You can see every link here where it says, that's a link to some kind of research. So there's a lot to actually say that psychotherapy can help with weight loss, you know, diet, et cetera, et cetera. So that overweight report can be helpful, but just remember that just because it says, you know, typical likelihood or whatever, that, you know, whatever is true for you, whatever you see on the scale is obviously reality. But this is saying if there's that genetic tendency. Now, what if you are overweight and you don't have that genetic tendency to be overweight? In that case, I would say that's good news, because what that means is if you have the genetic tendency to be overweight, that these reports calculate, of course, it's still possible to lose weight. It's still possible to be an optimal weight, but it does mean it's harder for you than the average person. If you don't have it, then that means that there's something else going on which is keeping you overweight. And in terms of what that something else is, that's something where you may want to do what we're doing now, which is sort by risk score and go, okay, what issues are going on which may be causing me to be high in weight, you know, struggle to lose weight or struggle to not regain weight. And so in the case of this person, they have results in a few different categories. One of them we've already talked about. They don't respond well to carbs. But another issue that we see here is hormones. And another issue we see here is blood sugar control. And another issue we see here is stress. And each of those things, if you have a hormonal imbalance, if you have a blood sugar imbalance, or if you have a issue of stress, all those things can stop you losing weight and can lead to you gaining weight. So it's really important to understand them. So let's start with hormones. Insulin is actually a hormone, but I'll treat it separately as high blood, you know, along with the blood sugar issue. So this person, they have a tendency for lower levels of T3 and T4. So what does that mean? So T3 and T4 are the active and storage versions of the thyroid hormone, also commonly known as thyroxine. So this is the storage version, this is the live active version. All this means is that people with your genes, when they have blood tests done on them, tend to have lower than average scores of these. Of course, it's not diagnostic, you may not have that, but it's saying that that is more likely. Now, what happens if that's the case? First of all, I would not assume that this is the case just based on this test. But this is the wonderful thing about genetic insights for, something very easy, just getting, some saliva and sending it off. It's much easier than getting a blood draw from a nurse, having to drive somewhere, all that kind of stuff, right? It's much, much cheaper as well. However, I'm not against blood tests. And in this case, if this person had these results, I would say to them, you may want to talk to your doctor and ask them if they could do a full thyroid panel, which would include free thyroxine, free T3 and free T4, to see if this is actually true for you. Because if it is a major factor that could lead to weight gain. In fact, every hormone that is listed here could be potentially a major factor that can lead to weight gain. So growth hormone is something that's often taken exogenously, so injected by bodybuilders, athletes, models, actors, and all the rest of it, because it's so effective at helping you to lose fat specifically. It doesn't really necessarily help you lose weight, because it often helps with actually holding on to muscle and bone mass, but it certainly helps you to lose fat. And so if you have a tendency towards lower levels of growth hormone, that could mean that you're lacking a hormone which can keep the fat off your body. So that's something that you want to know. In that case, again, you may want to consider testing with a doctor, and if it does turn out to be low, a doctor may prescribe that for you. So that's something that's really interesting to find out. In this case, you can see typical levels are much more common. That's why that bar is a lot longer, and having low levels is relatively rare. But still, it can happen. If it does happen, it's definitely worth knowing about. Another hormone is oxytocin. A lot of people are surprised that this one's in here. Oxytocin is often referred to as the love hormone, but oxytocin, in fact, I would say more than anything in terms of how it feels, because it's possible, again, as with growth hormone and thyroid, it's possible to, get it on prescription. The way it actually makes you feel is satisfied. And so off-label is sometimes used by doctors to help with addictions and compulsions, including the compulsion to overeat, because it can help you to feel satiated. The people kind of talk metaphorically about how they feel like they have a bottomless black hole inside them, especially people who have a tendency to be addicts often talk about this. Well, oxytocin is kind of the opposite of that. Oxytocin makes you feel fulfilled. It makes you feel full. It makes you feel, no, I don't need anything. I'm great as I am. And so a lot of the time when people struggle to lose weight, part of it is that they comfort eat, right? They eat to try and feel fulfilled. And so if you have a tendency towards low oxytocin levels, that could, again, be a reason for that. In the case of oxytocin, I think this is rarely tested, but it's something you could potentially talk to a hormone optimization doctor about if you relate to the symptoms of low oxytocin, and they may be able to test for you, but otherwise they may be willing to prescribe you oxytocin if you feel like that's something that would benefit you and they agree. So 2 more hormones that are obviously very important for weight loss are testosterone and estradiol. And estradiol is the most active form of estrogen. And so men and women both have both. Start with estrogen. So estrogen is a hormone that absolutely makes you put on weight. There's one other hormone that does that like majorly, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But estrogen is one of the 2 hormones. Estrogen gives the signal to your body to increase your fat, basically. And estrogen especially gives the signal to your hormone to increase your fat in your chest area and in your hips and buttocks area. And so that's why, estrogen is often associated with female or feminine, I guess is a better word, traits. Now, I'm saying it this way, it's not really the female hormone or the feminine hormone, because actually by the time most couples are in their 40s, the man will have just as much or more of this estradiol than women. So it's not exclusively female or feminine. But, I guess you could say it leads to those like feminine body traits, especially when someone's younger. But it absolutely is a weight loss hormone. A weight gain hormone, a fat gain hormone specifically. And so if you have a tendency for higher levels of estradiol, that's definitely something that's going to get in your way of losing weight. And that could be a case where you do everything right and you're exercising a lot and you're eating really well and you're reducing calories and the weight just doesn't come off. That could be down to high estrogen. And so if you have that tendency, again, it's a really great indicator to go, you know what, see your doctor and probably get that tested and see if it is higher than optimal. Now, testosterone is more relevant to men. Women do have it too, but they have a lot less throughout their lives than men do. And so testosterone is probably the major hormone in men that keeps them from having excess body fat. So testosterone gets converted by the body into estrogen, especially if a person is in an inflamed and stressed state. Then this enzyme called aromatase becomes more active and they convert more of their testosterone into estrogen. And in fact, that's why what I just said is the case, why a lot of men by the time they're in their 40s actually have more estrogen than their wives, because their wives' estrogen is starting to go down while their estrogen is building up more and more because their body's converting more of their testosterone to estrogen. So for men, it's really testosterone to estrogen ratio rather than it being, purely about testosterone. So yeah, if you have a tendency to low testosterone though, even if you have a tendency to normal estrogen, that would still mean a high ratio of estrogen to testosterone. So that could still lead to that tendency to gain fat that we were talking about. So testosterone also, of course, is anabolic. It leads to muscle gain. And the more muscle you have, the more calories that you burn and the harder it is to put on fat. So that's the other reason, or another big reason, why testosterone is a really good indicator of, being overweight, especially in men. Now, the main hormone that opposes estrogen in women is progesterone. We don't have a report for that at the time of me filming this. Hopefully we will by the time you actually see it. So if we do have that report by then high progesterone will lower and reduce the effect of estrogen, just like testosterone does. And it's that ratio again that's super important. You can always do blood tests of that, especially if you're concerned about potentially having high estrogen. And so the last hormone, the other hormone, which I referred to earlier, kind of leads us to our next section here, which is insulin. So the other main hormone that makes you gain weight, and the other thing that is very likely to be a culprit if you just can't seem to lose the weight, is insulin. And so this person has this tendency towards insulin resistance. So what is insulin? Very simply, insulin is the hormone that your pancreas produces to help to transport glucose or sugar from your blood to your cells where they can be used to make energy. And so insulin resistance is often referred to as pre-diabetes. And so what happens with insulin resistance is that for various reasons, and there's still dispute as to what ultimately causes this, but for whatever reason, your body becomes desensitized to insulin. And so then, kind of a simple way of saying it is when insulin tries to transport glucose into the cell resists it. It doesn't work. And so what happens in that situation is that more and more insulin builds up inside the bloodstream. And why is this bad? Well, first of all, insulin has a lot of very negative effects all throughout the body. We have an episode of this on the Rejuvenate podcast and YouTube if you want to find out more about this. It's a fairly complex topic, but bottom line of it is that insulin can build up more and more in your body. It creates all kinds of health issues, and one of them absolutely is weight gain, because insulin is a very pro-anabolic, holding on to weight hormone. Basically, the higher insulin is, the less your body will want to burn fat. That's probably a simple way of looking at it. And so if you have that tendency to high levels of insulin, if you have that tendency to insulin resistance, that's really an issue. And so insulin resistance is not something that's super easy to test for, unfortunately, but it absolutely is possible. And again, it's in that episode that I referred to, the YouTube episode. If you look up, insulin resistance Rejuvenate podcast, you'll be able to find that on YouTube or podcast platforms. But again, in a nutshell, if you have that tendency for insulin resistance, then you're going to want to, test for that in a way that works, which involves testing for both insulin and sugar, and then doing a little bit of a complex calculation, which I'll tell you about in that episode, rather than getting into so much detail on that here. But yeah, that's something that you want to test for. That's something you want to become aware of. Now, you don't have to test for it. If you read all these, signs and symptoms of insulin resistance and you think you have it, a lot of how to deal with it is common kind of lifestyle and dietary stuff, which you have the right to just do if you want. You don't have to have medical supervision, although it's always a good idea. But obviously, you can make dietary changes for yourself if you want. So that's something that you can potentially do if you have that genetic tendency. There are various supplements and other things that can potentially help with insulin resistance as well, as well as many other things that we talked about here. But again, I'll leave that for the YouTube episodes to go into more detail about that. So insulin resistance is what this person has, but what other issues could you have around blood sugar? Well, another one's actually here. So a tendency towards high blood sugar. Now, a tendency towards high blood sugar is kind of the next step after insulin resistance. So the first problem that tends to happen is that the insulin builds up in your blood and gets too high. But the next, if that is not resolved, eventually, and usually it takes years, usually people don't know they're insulin resistant, and then they don't start to realize they have a problem until they have this chronically high blood sugar, which is often referred to as type 2 diabetes. So again, as always, just because you have a higher risk score for it, like this person does. In fact, I know this person and they don't have it. So, and they're in their 40s. So it's not a guarantee, but they also live a healthy lifestyle and they follow a lot of the advice, which you would find in this report for you. So, if you have a high risk score, it's not something to be worried about. It's not something to, have fear about, but it is something to go, okay, I'm forewarned. And if you already have the issue, you can say, okay, I know of a genetic tendency for it, and how can I resolve it? How can genetic insights help me? And if you don't have the issue, you can go, you know what? It's good to know that I have a risk for that, and I can do my best to minimize the chance of it being an issue. In this particular case, with this particular person, they actually have quite a high chance, top 8% chance of having it. As it says here, up to 80% of the difference in people's risk for getting type 2 diabetes may be due to genetics. So, sometimes we do reports, but it's only 10 or 20% of it is genetic, so it's not such a big factor. But for this one, it obviously is a significant factor. So this person, if I were this person, I would just be aware of, I have to be on top of keeping my insulin balanced, keeping my blood sugar under control. And so there's various recommendations here. I've not actually seen before resistant starch as the first recommendation for this. So it just goes to show, every person is different. These recommendations are always different depending on who's actually looking at them in terms of, whose genetic information. The recommendations tend to be the same for people, but it's the order that they're in. So obviously a number one recommendation like that for this person is going to be way, way more important than a number 5 recommendation, like zinc for that person, or, which in turn will be more important than a number 8 recommendation. So that's high blood sugar. Let's talk about anything else. We talked about carbohydrates in relation to sugar already. So your HB or A1C, I think in America it's often just called A1C or hemoglobin A1C. This is kind of like a long-term blood marker measure of how your blood sugar has been the last few months. And so again, if that has a tendency to be high, that's very similar to getting this high blood sugar one. If you have hypoglycemia, so if you have a larger tendency for hypoglycemia. So hypoglycemia means when your blood sugar gets low. And of course, when our blood sugar is low, what do? We tend to get hungry, right? And we want to have something. And usually what we actually want is like not quote unquote health food. We don't generally want like a lean protein or something like that. We want sugar. We want carbs. We want donuts or potato chips or pizza or whatever it might be. So if you have that tendency for hypoglycemia, that's very important to know. Fasting glucose, to be honest, it's a little bit similar to the high blood sugar. It's just another way that it might show up. So high blood sugar is more high in general. Well, this one, it's more like high even when you're fasting. But again, if you have that tendency to have that raised, that's another indicator. And again, this is not a diagnostic tool, but I would use it as a way of narrowing down what the first things I would test for. If, you have a doctor, like if you have an insurance or a doctor who is not willing to do every test under the sun, or if you're paying for it personally, you're not able to afford to do every test under the sun, this can really help you narrow down what it is that might be, a top priority for you. Now, I guess when it comes to metabolism, so this is an interesting one. This person has a tendency for a low metabolic rate. So metabolism is how quickly your body utilizes energy. And obviously this one, if you have a low tendency to utilize energy, that's not good. That potentially means that you're more likely to gain weight. Even the world of whether having a fast metabolism or not is a good thing is a little bit contested in the world of science. But the bottom line of it is certainly in terms of longevity, they haven't quite decided yet. But in terms of weight loss, it is decided. The slower your metabolic rate, the more difficult it is to lose weight, and the easier it is to gain weight. And so if you have that tendency, you can first of all, as with all these reports, it's an opportunity to be compassionate to yourself. Like if it is much harder for you than someone else, even if it's like a brother or sister or someone really close, then this may well be why. You have this genetic variant and they don't. So that's important to know. The other thing is, of course, you can speed up your metabolism through various strategies. I won't go into them here, but I have an episode on that on the Rejuvenate podcast. It's all about metabolism and how to raise it. So if you're interested in finding out about that in more detail, you can go there. I forgot to mention this earlier, underactive thyroid, but I kind of covered it already when I talked about T3 and T4. These are all indicators of thyroid not working at its optimal level. In this case, this person does have a typical likelihood. But you see all these other, so this indicates a low metabolism. This T3 indicates low metabolism. T4 indicates low metabolism. The underactive thyroid doesn't indicate low metabolism, but when I see something like that, like 3 out of 4 markers, if there's only 1 marker out of 4 that indicates a low metabolism, I might, overall, as long as the person's healthy, they might not have it. But when there's 3 markers indicating that they, out of 4 that you have a low metabolism, that is something that I would be potentially paying attention to. So the other big factor that we haven't talked about yet is, emotions. And so I'd start here with stress. So this person has a tendency for high stress. So how is this related? Well, first of all, if you have high stress, especially over long periods of time, that's will lead to high cortisol over a long period of time. And cortisol, once cortisol is high, you're more likely to have high insulin. You're more likely to have high blood sugar. You're more likely to have high estrogen. You're more likely to have high serotonin, which I'll talk about in a minute. And you're more likely to have low testosterone. And you're more likely to have low progesterone and low growth hormone. All the things I just explained to you. And in fact, at a certain level, you're more likely to have low thyroid as well. So basically, all the weight loss hormones will go down when your cortisol stays high for too long, and all the weight gain hormones will go up. So that's one big reason why stress is super important. And this person, they have a top 1% tendency to be stressed. So for this person, and this is probably why it was like the number one here, because it's sort by risk score. We can't always give a percentage, but we do whenever we can. So it's even though this person has several issues that may make it hard for them to lose weight, like eating a lot of carbs would make it very hard for them to lose weight. Having a potentially underactive or suboptimal thyroid and metabolism will make it hard for them to lose weight. Definitely having high insulin resistance will make it hard for them to lose weight. But the top factor for this person actually seems to be having high stress. Because of what I said. So high stress will have a knock-on effect on these other things. And in fact, it could well be the thing that knocks a lot of these things over the edge. Meaning, you may not have insulin resistance, and you may have, a normal metabolism, and you may be doing okay with carbs. But then when you have a period in your life of high stress, maybe, a house move, a divorce, and whatever it is, those things, death, the things they say are the most stressful in life, like maybe a chronic, long-lasting infection. When any of those things happen, they can knock you off balance, and then you can suddenly start to feel, not good. Now, of course, a lot of people stress eat as well. So this is another reason why stress often, but not always, leads to weight gain. It does depend on these other factors to some degree, because if a person tends to have high stress, but they're really high adrenaline, then sometimes they don't gain weight because the adrenaline actually kind of reduces your appetite. But if it's more like high cortisol, and then that in turn is driving up the estrogen, then it's more likely that the person might end up overweight. Now, another, mood issue would be low mood. So if people are depressed, it absolutely means they're more likely to overeat and not move very much, which obviously from a simple calories in, calories out perspective means they're more likely to gain weight. I do think there's also more to it than that. What I see is when people are really depressed, their metabolism also slows down. That's part of the process of being depressed. It's what's called the dorsal vagal state in the polyvagal theory. So this state of being kind of partly shut down, or like in a low energy production state. And when you're in a low energy production state, then you do not need as many calories. And if you are eating a normal amount of calories or even more calories because you're trying to make yourself feel better, that can definitely lead to a weight gain situation. Serotonin. So, in our reports, we only can ever do 100% mainstream science that's, validated by all the health authorities and all the rest of it. But it is also mainstream science to say serotonin in excess is an issue, right? So my personal perspective is that you would want to keep your serotonin pretty low on the, scale. But you certainly don't want it high. When it's high, it is a stress chemical, often acts in concert with other stress chemicals and has all those negative effects that I just said about cortisol. They're all true, potentially, of serotonin as well, when the serotonin is too high. I've also included lipase in here because lipase is the fat digestion enzyme. And so if you have that tendency to have less of that, that's going to be potentially an issue. Now, we talked about the two big, realm of mental health issues, but I include psychological trauma here as well, because it can be the case that when someone is traumatized, that's like a root cause issue that no matter what else, the person doesn't get better. Now, obviously, a genetic insights report can't tell you whether you have been psychologically traumatized because, of course, that's something that, either has or has not happened to you. What we are talking about here is how well you're able to recover from it. Some people have quite objectively horrific stuff happen to them maybe earlier in life, and for whatever reason, they're able to move past it with, some degree of ease and still live a, high quality of life. Well, some people have traumas that others may not think are such a big deal, but it haunts them and plagues them and stops them from, ever being able to fully engage with life and enjoy life. And I'm not making anyone wrong about that. The thing that I've learned again from genetic insights in that regard is it's, if you don't handle trauma well, it's not because, you're a wimp. And if you do handle it well, it's not because you're a hero. It's just in your DNA. And so some people have a tendency to just not be able to process trauma very well. And so especially if that's the case for you, that can be a reason why it's very hard to lose weight. The kind of psychological explanation for this would be that, when you keep excess weight on you, it's like a buffer that keeps other people away potentially. Maybe an attempt to make yourself less attractive, an attempt to make yourself, bigger, to keep more of a distance. People attempt to maybe, make people scared of you rather than you being scared of them. There's all kinds of potential psychological reasons why someone may gain weight or struggle to lose weight, which could have a psychological basis. So that's, an indicator of that. Another potential factor, and the last thing that I'll just look at here is eating disorders. So most of these eating disorders, of course, are around not eating enough, anorexia, bulimia, binge eating. But I still thought it's worth putting in there because if you do have a high tendency for eating disorders, you may well have a tendency to go through phases people often do of binging and purging. And so in some cases, you may be overweight because you are binging. And so it's very, very important to understand if that is the root of what's going on for you. Again, of course, this can't diagnose you with that, but if you have that higher risk of it, then that could be a factor that you need to investigate and find out if that's what's going on for you. Some people, they just don't realize that's what's going on for them. And in many cases, I guess people do know what's going on for them, but they still find it really helpful to get the genetic report because they can say, okay, it's not just that, whatever. It's actually, I have this genetic tendency to do it. And so obviously I still need to try and treat myself and heal myself or, be treated and healed, but I can stop being hard on myself. And a lot of the time, part of that healing journey is just self-love and self-acceptance and, loving yourself as you are. So it can be really useful in that regard, as can all of these reports really, because no matter what's going on for you. And I'll just say as well, this person has 6 high risk scores here, and they do have an issue with, like, it's a struggle for them to lose weight. This person here, which is me, has never had a struggle to lose weight. I'll be honest. I've had a struggle to gain weight before. I've literally never been overweight. And then, sure enough, here I've only got one potential risk marker for that tendency to be overweight. And in fact, that's low thyroid function, which is true for me. That is a diagnosed condition I have. But it's interesting. In my case, low thyroid function showed up as being underweight, not overweight. And so again, that's what I was saying, how, any one of these factors on its own often will not necessarily create the problem, but especially when you have a bunch of them, that's where the weight can be so difficult to keep off or so difficult to, not regain. So I hope that was of value to you. My recommendation would be, go through your reports. I've obviously skipped through it. I've tried to be as quick as possible here for the sake of time, but you should, read through all of your reports, really pay attention to them. But I hope this gives you some helpful guidance about how you can use them. So of course, learn about yourself as much as possible. If you get leads here for potential medical issues, then definitely go to a doctor and get some testing done to find out if they may actually be the case or not, or if you're on the way to them maybe. And if all is good in that area, then focus on the other areas that you can control more easily, like diet and lifestyle and potentially stress.